Welcome. I see people coming into from the waiting room. I'm going to start in just a second. Okay, great. So good evening. I'm excited to welcome you to this last session in our three-part series, Reproductive Justice, Jewish Ethics, and Family Planning, Post-Roe Realities, offered by Adat Shalom Reconstructionist Congregation with great appreciation to our co-sponsors, the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and the National Council of Jewish Women. I'm Minister Linda Morse, and Adat Shalom's Jewish Studies Committee co-chairs invited me to create a series that would leave participants faced with myriad policy questions in the wake of Dobbs v. Jackson, feeling better able to take stands grounded in Jewish ethics and facts on the ground. This series has embraced both Jewish ethical and reproductive justice frameworks, and it has looked at how the overturn of Roe impacts not only access to basic reproductive health and the choice to not grow a family at a particular time, but also complexifies the realities and ethics of various means of growing families. This week, we are looking at how the Dobbs decision may exacerbate ethical complexities that already exist in the worlds of adoption and child welfare. Before we introduce the topic and our speakers, a few housekeeping items which haven't changed. We are asking that everyone stay on mute, and our tech volunteer, Carol Stern, has arranged for that. We are a large group and we want to be mindful of everyone's time. We may have time at the very end to lift that restriction at least a little bit. We will be welcoming questions and seeking answers at intervals throughout and at the end of the panel discussion. So please, we invite you to drop questions in the chat to Carol or to myself. We will track questions and share them aloud with our speakers at the appropriate junctures. Lastly, I sent out a handout last night to registrants for today's session. A lot of great recommended reading there on the subjects we're covering. For anyone who may not have received it, we're dropping that link in the chat. Thank you, Carol. And so I'm going to introduce our speakers. There are longer bios on the handout. First, in order of their general appearance this evening, though they all should be spotlighted on the screen for you. Gabrielle Glazer is an investigative journalist and New York Times bestselling author. Her book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, examines post-war adoption in the US through the eyes of one teenager and the son she was forced to relinquish. Glazer lays bare how a predatory adoption industry coerced more than 3 million young mothers into surrendering their babies into a secretive system, and she unearths the attitudes toward sex, marriage, gender, and race that underlay this chapter of a not-so-distant American past. Gregory D. Luce is a Minnesota-based attorney who was born and adopted in the District of Columbia. He is the founder of the Adoptee Rights Law Center, where he advocates for legislative changes and represents adult adopted people on issues of identity documents, birth records, and U.S. citizenship. He is also the executive director of Adoptees United Incorporated, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the equality of all adopted people. And Anna Ahrens is currently on faculty at NYU School of Law, where she also serves as the Impact Project Director of NYU's Family Defense Clinic. Starting this fall, she will be an assistant professor at St. John's University School of Law. Anna's scholarship focuses on the government's regulation and policing of families and the intersection of parental rights and race, gender, and poverty. Prior to moving into academia, she was a public defender representing parents in cases where the government was attempting to remove their children from their care or otherwise impinge on their rights. I am thrilled to share all three with you all. I've been honored to get to know them and their work these last few months and even years. Excuse me. Tonight, we're talking about a subject that I feel very close to. I'm going to take the liberty here of offering some Jewish ethical framing for tonight's discussion. Some of you know that I did a part-time certificate program in Jewish ethics during COVID at the Jewish Theological Seminary. While I don't for one moment question the power of love that is not connected to biology, I also know that biology matters to each of us. in many ways. Over the years, I've also become increasingly critical of adoption mythology and many practices, and I've been longing for a framework for exploring these concerns through a Jewish ethical lens. I went into my studies knowing that there really wasn't an analog for modern adoption in Jewish history or tradition. I learned that what we had instead was something much more akin to guardianship, a role the ancients called the apotropos. The apotropos may help care for, may fully care for, may be a child's sole day-to-day devoted grown-up, and may love them to the moon and back for a lifetime. But what that arrangement never attempted to do was cut off a child's knowledge of or connection to their biological family. By the time I presented a paper on the subject at the Society for Jewish Ethics Conference in 2022, I was looking at the Jewish ethics of adoption and child welfare squarely through a reproductive justice lens. As we learned in session 1, for those who were unfamiliar, reproductive justice looks not just at the right of all women to choose not to have children at a particular time, but also the right of all women, Black, brown, and poor included, to have children and to raise them in dignity and health. Through that lens, I've come to understand that while sometimes family separation and the provision of love and security from others, even in the form of adoption, may be necessary for the well-being of a child, too often that separation is what's called a permanent solution to a temporary problem. There are too many unnecessary family separations. Try as we might, we can't actually erase the lifelong pain that family separation imposes on first parents and children alike, nor erase the reality that poverty currently is too often the cause for family separation, nor the reality, per an article by Gretchen Sissons in your handout and others in your handout, that lack of reproductive choice increases the risk of family separation at some point in a child's life. Despite what Justices Coney Barrett or Alito may suggest, an unwanted pregnancy does not equal an unwanted child, and separation is traumatic. So before we turn to our speakers, I wanted to offer that initial framing of concern for first families and first parents as a particularly Jewish one, a call for a fundamental kavod or respect, a call to care for the many disenfranchised in our midst, not just those young ones we may see as akin to orphans. Okay, so turning back to our guests. I'd like to turn to Gabrielle first, whose book, American Baby, is an incredible deep dive into the history of adoption in the US and into a specific story of one adoptee and 2 Jewish families, the one who lost him via adoption, but never stopped looking for him, and the one who lovingly raised him to manhood. Gabrielle, can you offer a little about the particulars of David Rosenberg's and his mother Margaret's story, and also a sense of the timeline or arc of adoption's history in the US for us?
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for that nice introduction. The American Baby focuses on the story of a young woman who at the age of 16 in New York City got pregnant. She was the daughter of German Jewish refugees. Her boyfriend was the son of 2 Holocaust refugees. They were high school sweethearts. And this was an era, it's important to remember, in 1961 in New York City, with no sex education, no birth control, even for married people until Griswold in 1965, and very little, and of course, no abortion. Margaret's sex education in George Washington Heights was from her mother, and it was as follows: put a sweater on, don't give them the right idea. She got pregnant the first time she had intercourse and was forced by social mores, the horror of her family, both sides of the family, and in fact, New York state law, which had made premarital sex a crime under wayward minor codes that had existed, had been on the books since the 19th century. They were incredibly vague. They involved shoplifting, premarital sex, you name it, and anything, being obstreperous with your parents. So she tried. She and George Katz were boyfriend and girlfriend. They were in love. They wanted to keep their baby. Their families were horrified and pushed them into the New York City system, which was run by religion at the time. All New York State adoptions were organized in terms of the religion of the birth mother. So Margaret went to the Louise Wise Agency, which was the largest and most prestigious Jewish adoption agency in the entire United States at that time. But her system was not that much unlike that of 3.5 other million young women who had gotten pregnant at a time where, as I've just mentioned, those lack of reproductive choices, that lack of education, they're the only choice many of these women had were to be forced into this coercive, lucrative system that ran nationwide. There were multitudinous maternity homes. I believe there were more than 400 of them. And it was quite a lucrative operation at a time when the American dream was for a man and woman to get married after decades of a low birth rate, first the Depression and then World War II. Suddenly, there was a massive social impetus to have a family. And if you couldn't conceive in the years after the war, there was also very little reproductive technology, assisted reproductive technology. So this myth that you just somehow mentioned and were that you just said, Minna, about, oh, all right, well, origin stories don't matter. That was very much the social code of the day in terms of adoption. The young women who had gotten pregnant because they were bad girls, they were no good nicks, and they deserved to have their babies taken from them. And the babies would go then to a married couple, presumably in the suburbs, who could offer a better life. End of story. That was the general story that was circulating in the country from about 1946 until 1972, just before Roe v. Wade. And it was certainly the story that David Rosenberg, who was born Stephen Mark Earl to Margaret Earl and George Katz, that was the story that he had been told. He was adopted by a Romanian Holocaust survivor and his wife, a cantor, who loved him deeply, and he them. But the story, the backstory that he had received was that your mother didn't want you. She had something better to do. She was going off to become a doctor. She was going off to become a scientist. And these were the parents you were meant to have. That doesn't discount that everybody loved him. And everybody did love him. Everybody loved David. He was actually a friend of mine. That's how I got onto the story. But the secrecy that had separated David from the love of his biological family, his birth family, the siblings, George and Margaret, ended up getting married. They had 3 more full siblings of David's. And importantly, also, I know sometimes this is challenging to talk about, but medical history as well. Margaret, the one thing she knew she could do as a Jewish mother, as a teenage Jewish mother who didn't have access to her son, was to leave records of family conditions, which were legion. And they never reached David. And ultimately, they were able to reunite 3 months before he died of some of the very illnesses about which Margaret had spent her life trying to warn him. That's tragic enough, but what really was profoundly compelling to me and moving to me as a human being was the lack of David's knowledge of his origin story and the feelings of rejection that he had that were supplanted once he knew the real story. That his parents had tried everything they could to maintain custody of him, trying to elope as minors. Many things, but that we're not here to talk about. We're not here to talk about the particulars of that. But that was a microcosm, his story and his realization at the very end of his life about what really had happened, what he had been told versus what the reality of his beginnings were shocking. And he was a cantor. He was appalled by the secrecy of the system. And of course, as in terms of Jewish ethics, one of our origin stories starts with an adoption. So that didn't escape him. And we'll get into the secrecy of adoption later, the adoptions at the time. every state except for two, Alaska and Kansas, walled off an original birth certificate from the adoptee and his birth parents. An original birth certificate was issued when a child was born, and it was then sealed by state officials, and it remains sealed. Greg can talk about that in a moment. And an amended birth certificate naming the adoptee's new name and the adoptive parents as his original mother and father was issued in its place. And that system really served to separate any way of birth families ever finding their kin, or adoptees ever finding their birth families. And the reasons for that, and then I'll be quiet, were threefold. The first was to shield the birth mother from proof of her so-called wantonness. So it was really sexual policing. The second was to protect the adoptee from the taint of illegitimacy, but it was also, the sealed records were also a way to reassure adoptive parents that no one would come to interfere with their newly created family. And they too had lost. If they were unable to conceive at this boom, boom time of American history where everybody was procreating, that was also a loss. So, and the system persists today, but we'll get to that, I'm sure.
Thank you. And so that era from 46 to 72 is known as the baby scoop era,
Right.
right? Tell us a little bit about the history of adoption in America before that era emerged, and then what changes you've seen since that era sort of closed informally. Not to,
Adoption in the early colonial days was very informal. There was a lot of death. And we lived in an agricultural society at the time. And if your neighbor or your sister died, or there were, there was a cholera outbreak in up and down the Mississippi, which happened in the early 19th century. If a child survived and there were nearby relatives or nearby neighbors who would take the child in, it was always understood. All right, well, this is who you came from, but we're raising you now. When industrialization occurred in the mid-19th century, there was enormous death in teeming US cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York especially. And when men who would go to work in factories and live in tenement apartment buildings, when they would die or they would come home and bring the disease that they caught, whether it was some form of dysentery, you name it, any manner of infectious disease at that time could have been a lethal, just kill everyone in the family, could have been a lethal blow to an entire factory, an entire apartment building. And children often survived. And probably because I'm not going to get into the reasons of that, I'll stop myself. But children often survived. And they were then sent to orphanages, especially in New York City. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the orphan trains. And that was something that began. There was a minister from Connecticut named Charles Loring Brace, who came to New York, saw the children who were lice-ridden and barefoot and really struggling in tremendously awful conditions, with sleeping together with absolutely no hygiene whatsoever, maybe having a piece of bread and gruel for dinner, really all over twist kind of conditions. He decided that he was going to fix this by taking these children who were from, by and large, they were immigrant families. They were not Anglo-Saxon Protestant young children who were on the streets selling matches. And he believed that he could kind of Christianize them, he could waspize them by taking them, I just made a verb out of a ridiculous acronym. Sorry about that. But he arranged for something called these orphan trains, which took as many the orphan trains and its pretender. It's sorry, I'm a little tired today. You know the reason why. The orphan train and its imitators eventually developed a system by which they would scoop up these so-called orphans, many of whom were not orphans. Many of them had one living parent left, but if the father was dead, and it was far more likely for a father to die because of the repeated terrible exposure to whatever illness was happening to be going around in his factory, the children were then surrendered. They were taken by the state. The mother also had no way of supporting her children. Tens of thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of children were sent on trains, almost alone, scared and terrified. Some of them didn't even speak English. They were Italian immigrants, Polish immigrants, and they were shipped to Midwestern farms where there was essentially an agreement, a kind of bill of sale. The children would be marched along in town halls and in church lobbies where they were examined, their teeth were looked at, their eyes were open to see what kind of disease they had. They were basically looked at as animals. And in many cases, while there are certainly records of some of these so-called orphan train riders, some of them were treated well, many of them were really treated like chattel slavery and like chattel slaves. And news of this began getting back to reformers in the early 19th century. This went on from 1854 until I believe the last one was in the 1920s. And by that time, and this is an important piece of social history, by the 1920s, hygiene had really advanced. Life expectancy for children had also changed, shifted dramatically, improved quite significantly. And there was such a thing as an actual childhood. A childhood, there were toys, there were factory-made teddy bears, there were Crayola crayons, and a child went from being a form of essential labor to a little human being to whom you could have deep sentimental attachment. And that shifted the beginnings of modern adoption. And many people wanted to help provide a childhood for many of these children who were perhaps in terrible circumstances. And adoption in the United States began very altruistically, quite altruistically. There was a series of women who were quite powerful in New York City, who were very involved with the politics of maternalism. This was Upton Sinclair time and Sinclair Lewis. This was, the height of the jungle. And nobody was really looking after children, except women began to identify this system of the orphan trains and of how they might better improve the lot of little kids who didn't have homes. And there were still quite a few orphans at the time. And they began what was called sentimental adoption. And that began in New York City. There were 3 agencies. The Louise Wise Agency was one of them. And there were 2 others that were quite prominent. And it became quite a powerful and important signal to the rest of the world that, yes, our society is changing. This is in the roaring 20s, of course. There was a lot of money going around in the Gilded Age and beyond. And it was seen as a positive thing to take a child who had perhaps a different background and raise him or her as one's own. And that's how we got to real stranger adoption, actually raising a child as one of your family.
Right. And the sort of the replacement mentality of what I've been calling family supersession.
Right. Mhm.
Right. So the much has changed. Um, there has not been as much. There has been movement towards openness and adoption, and yet my children still have birth certificates that suggest that I gave birth to them, which I clearly did not. Um, the 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 children, the parents and children during the baby scoop era were predominantly white and middle class or upper class even. Um, and there was a long transition to transracial, international adoption, and so much larger mix and different dynamics going on. But Greg, I think you're about my age, and I think that you're a child of a closed adoption. Am I right?
That's correct. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
I'm probably your age, and I'm squarely within the baby scoop era, 1965. Yeah.
So I would love to see a time when there's something besides these sort of fictional birth certificates, something that's more truthful. However it unfolds. But in terms of having access to information about who you are, where you came from, um, can you tell us a little bit about your own story and how you got into work as an attorney who advocates on behalf of adult adoptees?
Sure. Yeah, and when I became more active and more even aware of my identity as an adopted person, I for years I've tried to situate where I was in all of adoption, and had my blinders on for a lot of that time as well, trying to understand, okay, yeah, I'm part of the baby scoop era that Gabrielle writes so beautifully about in her book. But I've come to understand that there's really, I consider there's 4 parallel paths that adoption has currently and is still on. And those are, 1 is the baby scoop era, and I'll talk about the secrecy around that. 2 is how we treated Native Americans, first with, well, going way back, but how it's connected to adoption is first the residential boarding schools that removed Native children from their communities and forced them to go to school. That later developed into the Indian Adoption Project, where Native children were literally taken from their communities and adopted by largely East and Midwest parents, white parents. So there's that transracial element there, but it also led to the Indian Child Welfare Act, because tearing these communities. That's one track. The other is Black Americans never really aren't really on this path of adoption. They're on a path of, and I'm looking forward to what Professor Ahrens has to say about this, a path of family policing, where their families are essentially ripped apart by the child welfare system and have been for hundreds of years, whether it's enslaved people who have had their families destroyed, or it's today in the child welfare system where they're policed and families are torn apart by various reasons, but often it's disproportionately, if not always disproportionately, families of color. And then there's intercountry adoption, which is a third parallel, which essentially began in the late 40s and got its heyday in the 50s. And that was based a lot on partially evangelical Christians, the Holts out in Oregon, but also about ideology of showing the world that we can adopt children of color as long as they were not Black, was essentially the ideology behind that. So you got a lot of Korean adoptees and also adoptees from countries that had humanitarian crises related to World War II and the Korean War. And then you get the baby scoop era, which is what Gabrielle has been talking about and writes about. And also Gabrielle is actually doing a project on the Indian residential boarding schools, which I'm excited to see that come out. But I was born in 65 to, now I know, to a wealthy white woman who was kicked out of Mount Holyoke College because she found herself pregnant and not married, and moved to a maternity home in the District of Columbia where no one knew who she was, or and was essentially shamed or coerced in some respects into relinquish me for after my birth, relinquishing me for adoption. And then she was told to forget about it. and move on with your life, just as Margaret Katz was in American Baby. And so I grew up as adopted and born and adopted in the District of Columbia, adopted by a Maryland couple, moved to Oklahoma, was raised there, and didn't really think a whole lot about my adoption for years, as a lot of adoptees don't, until you have a kid, or until there's some sort of issue that forces you to think about yourself and your identity, more so in transracial adoptees and in white adoptees who are sort of matched to their families. But I wanted to know more when I had my child, and I began my efforts to find out information. So I contacted the courts in DC and found out that I could petition the court and get my records unsealed. I didn't even know that records were sealed and unavailable, but they were. And so I did that, and I got an order saying, yep, we're unsealing your records. But all that meant was that they would send my case over to a social worker and determine if my mother wants to know if I want any contact. And that would involve sometimes a years long search. And if they didn't want contact, then I would get nothing. So I didn't go through with that. 10 years later, I really wanted to get more information. And at that time, my mother, my birth mother, had registered for an online registry. And these registries were informal, privately run. If she registered and I registered, there would be a match, and we could we could find each other, which we did. And I wasn't really, that's sort of happenstance. I wasn't prepared for a search and reunion, even though, I've loved every minute of it. I just wanted to know who I was and where I came from. And that was the original birth certificate. That tells you who you were born to and where you were born. In fact, my amended certificate after the adoption eliminated any mention of any identifying pieces of information, including the actual hospital I was born in, and also that my mother's address at the time was a maternity home in Georgetown. So by that time I had a kid, I was a lawyer, and I thought, I'm gonna just throw everything I can to get my own birth record. And by that time, I knew who my birth mother was. I knew who my birth father was. They had actually married about 9 months after my birth. And so I didn't see any big deal of getting my own birth record, which would give me that information on paper. But it took me 3.5 years of court proceedings to do that, including going up on appeal after the trial court had said, you can have your birth record, but we're going to redact your father's name, which is not uncommon in the US. They'll redact parent names and you get a redacted, your own birth record is redacted. And so I appealed that. And finally, 3 years ago, after starting that in 2016, I got a copy of my original birth certificate in the mail. And I can't tell you how meaningful it is to sit there with my wife and my younger son to open that piece of mail and hold in my hand the record of my birth, an accurate, factual record of my birth. It is incredibly meaningful for the state to acknowledge that who you are. And that's colored my work now. My work today is about changing legislation like District of Columbia's legislation so that I can apply for, pay a small fee, and in a few weeks I get my original birth certificate with my name, possibly a name on it, and possibly my birth parents' names on it. And also it's a right, a human right, to have that information. So I'm working in all sorts of states to change that. Currently today, well, starting in July, there'll be 14 states that allow you to do that. And I'm working in Minnesota now where I'm based, and it probably looks likely it'll be the 15th pretty soon. And so that's the work that I do, as well as work with intercountry adoptees who are denied US citizenship, even though they are adopted by US citizen parents. That's a whole nother issue, but one that is very important to me. So that's my long story. The work that I do now is driven by what I experienced myself. So.
Thank you. You also, I have found you recently to be a really great explainer, there's a better word than that, of some other issues on the domestic adoption front that that have been sort of driven by the anti-adoption right and
Anti-abortion,
oh, what did I say?
anti-adoption.
Anti-abortion,
Yeah, I get
right.
those two confused sometimes too.
Anti-abortion.
Right.
And one of them is actually was basically alluded to, at least in some regard, by Justice Amy Coney Barrett in her questions during arguments of Dobbs v. Jackson, where she suggested that not only that abortion wasn't necessary because mothers could always relinquish to adoption, but specifically that they could do so with anonymity because of safe haven laws that have, but there's also this added layer recently to the safe haven thing, which I'd love for you to explain for folks, but also there's like these safe haven baby boxes
Right.
that have troubling implications, and actually just relinquishing the idea that it's good to relinquish with anonymity
Mhm.
throws us back, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the baby boxes and that whole
Right.
thing?
So the safe haven laws developed starting in 1999 in Texas, and they call their law the Moses Law. And what now they're tradition. There's what's called traditional safe havens, which is you can bring a baby into a hospital, to a fire station, and physically hand it over to an employee anonymously, and then the baby is considered safe, and you wouldn't be prosecuted. The mother wouldn't be prosecuted for abandonment unless the baby is injured. It doesn't apply in that case. Those have been around in every state now since 1999. Well, not in every state, but over time they grew, and now they're in every state. It's very exceedingly rare for a woman to abandon her infant. But in these safe haven laws, and I'll talk a little bit more about the baby boxes, the studies have shown what they've done essentially is they're not saving lives, they're actually increasing abandonments. And that's where, as an adopted person, we object to making us anonymous, making so we have zero records of our birth. We don't know who we are, our heritage. It could be used to bypass ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. It can be used for trafficking as well, trafficking of infants, especially baby boxes. And that's what we're seeing now with after the Dobbs decision and essentially the mention of safe haven laws, the increasing number of states that are authorizing the installation of baby boxes in fire stations or at hospitals. And what all a baby box is, and sometimes they call it an incubator, or it's often called generically a newborn safety device. It's built into the exterior wall of a fire station or hospital, or sometimes urgent care. And a mother or anyone can take an infant. Typically, you have to be less than 30 days old for the infant to be abandoned, and place that infant in the box, close the door, and walk away. And then that child is retrieved by the firefighters on the other side, or the hospital staff on the other side, and that child is now almost immediately placed for adoption. Infants are probably the most prized market, if you want to call it market, and I do, in adoption, and they are very readily adopted. So the problem was one, anonymous relinquishments, which adoptees have been fighting against for years. But it's also the increased ability to traffic infants for adoption. And so I'll share my screen to show you one law that has just passed Indiana, which is essentially the world capital of baby boxes. They have almost, if not 100 baby boxes in the state now. And the second most state is Arkansas with 14. And that's because Indiana is where the Safe Haven Baby Box Company, a corporation, exists to produce, to promote, to install, and to have a hotline that vulnerable women can call, that Safe Haven Baby Box can direct them to a Safe Haven Baby Box in a fire station. So they have this, what I call vertical integration in a market of marketing infants for adoption, where they control all aspects of that market. But I'll share my screen now and show you this Indiana law, which has essentially has been signed by the governor. Let's see if I can do this. Get it going. Didn't think I'd have a loading. There we go. So this is Indiana Senate Bill 345. It's in law now. You don't have to look at all the details here. This is just somewhat of how complicated the law is. But where I have those little triangles with exclamation points, those are corruption or trafficking points where you can use these baby boxes for that purpose. And this is the real problem. When you have a baby box, an anonymous person can just put the infant in a baby box and walk away. You don't know who that person is. You don't know if it's the mother, it's an abusive father, abusive boyfriend, a trafficker. Any number of people could do that and just walk away without any repercussions. An employee of, as I stated, would take that baby on the other side of that box. And in Indiana, they don't even have to report the surrender or abandonment to the child welfare authorities in the locality or the state. They can call an adoption agency directly. And that's why I have that phone on there. It says, hello, this is Adoption Agency Inc. How can I help you? Oh, hey Jim, you've got another infant for us, huh? And then that baby is placed directly with that adoption agency. And then within 15 days or immediately is given to a pre-approved couple for adoption. And then within 15 days, the adoption proceeding must be filed. And the court under this law is prohibited from asking about the origins of the baby's abandonment. And so it's this hidden route to traffic infants for adoption. We don't know what happened to the mom, whether she's abused or not. There's no protection. And it's a way of getting around all the regulations of adoption. And we're now really concerned that this will be the route to avoid child welfare regulations and laws that govern how adoptions are to occur. And we're seeing these laws now. There's 7 new laws in 7 states at this point. There's been very little opposition, even among Democrats, to these laws. Most are passed unanimously, 50 to nothing or 104 to nothing. And it's because they hear the story of children being left in dumpsters, infants left in dumpsters, and those infants dying. And they're not true. It's not true. It's so rare to happen that all this is doing is increasing the abandonment of infants. It's not saving lives. It's not directing what should happen, and that's to support vulnerable women who find themselves pregnant. That's just gone. They're just like giving up on that. And that's part of where our child welfare system does a terrible job of doing that. And that's putting more and more pressure for people like the Safe Haven Baby Box Company to say, well, you can just put your baby in a box and walk away and forget about it. Just like in the baby scoop era, you're just going to forget about it. You won't forget about it.
And no one did.
No one did. Yeah, they struggled. My mom struggled for decades after that. Yeah.
There's a legal scholar by the name of Oberman. It's like a Michelle or Melissa. Is anyone familiar with her? I didn't put anything in the handout, but she's been sort of covering the territory of disproving the idea that the baby boxes save lives.
Right.
So I will share that later if I find her.
Yeah, I just came across a Danish study that looked at 10 high-income countries, which included the US, and that was their conclusion, that they do not save lives. In fact, it essentially increases abandonments because it becomes a tool It's a gimmick, really, more than a tool.
I've got a question from Louise Milkman. Do most adoption agencies, do agencies get involved in this? Do most adoption agencies accept babies from the baby boxes or work with fire departments, or does some agencies object to the concept?
I don't know of any adoption agency that objects to that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's a few adoption agencies that, but I don't know many adoption agencies. There are a few that I know that would probably say no. But yeah, the market is so there's so much demand for infants in this market that if one said no, five would say yes.
Right. I would say that, I mean, as I mentioned, like as an adoptive parent, I sort of grew to become more kind of curious and critical about how adoptions were unfolding and sort of subtle coercion that was potentially happening with birth parents, lack of options counseling, things that were of concern, and all of us. And then there's all these even pre Dobbs, a lot of just much more Wild West going on in terms of unlicensed facilitators sort of dropping in and advertising for people in great need, almost, I mean, sort of like pregnancy crisis centers that have an adoption agency arm, things like that. And then with Dobbs and the baby boxes may not have like delivered that many babies thus far. I mean, delivered, but it's just sort of a great symbol of the dangers that I think the Dobbs decision puts us in, and especially that the rhetoric around it promotes that.
Right. The rhetoric, it's interesting. The rhetoric around it is how brave these women were, which is also the rhetoric of adoption itself.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is the reality that some women may turn to relinquishment for fear because they might be able to choose a parent, and rather than their child getting sucked into the foster system.
Right.
And in advertising this class, I said that the already challenged and perhaps overreaching child welfare system, and I think I used that maybe not so perhaps. So I wanted to turn to Professor Anna Ahrens, for a description of sort of the ways in which the child welfare system is already troubled and problematic, and how Dobbs may exacerbate those problems.
Sure, yeah. And I think I will kind of take as a starting point, as a background assumption that I hold pretty deeply, that to me, this question of reproductive justice and of restricting abortion is really inextricably linked to this larger project of regulating families, and particularly regulating poor families and families of color in this country. And that's something that I think both Gabrielle and Greg have already touched on. If we are to go back to the enslavement and separation of enslaved families, the very systematic separation, assimilation of Indian children through the boarding schools through, up through the 60s and 70s, and thinking also about, even things like the orphan trains, which were not filled with orphans, but were in fact filled with children from New York or the East Coast who had families who loved them, but didn't have the resources to care for them in the way that looked right to Charles Loring Brace or other reformers like him. And so I think we can take that as a backdrop, but we can also think about how those same trends, those same organizations even, are continuing to shape the child welfare system today. So the organization, for example, that Charles Loring Brace started was called the Children's Aid Society, and that continues to exist in New York City as one of the primary foster care agencies that continues to be involved in the removal and placement of children in the city. And so, I can talk about it as a historical backdrop, but it's really the continuing presence of these same organizations. So I think it's kind of helpful to kind of zoom out and think about what the child welfare system is doing and who it is affecting, because I think it is a system that is vast, and it is a system that is really beneath the notice of people with money in this country, and particularly people with money who are white in this country. And I say this as someone who was raised, in a family where my parents are white, my parents are Jewish. They both were college educated. I think there are ways in which my family and the patterns in my family escaped notice of the system, where if our demographics had been different, we would have been squarely in the center of all of that. I'll stop spreading my family business at this point, but I'm sure I will come back to that in some capacity. But if we think about what the family, I apologize, I in my work often call it the family regulation system, but I'm going to try to call it the child welfare system to kind of streamline things, but I apologize if I slip. So if we think about what the child welfare system is doing, it is a system that is almost 70% of reports received nationwide are reports of child neglect rather than child abuse. So that means that most allegations that are coming in are not that a child has been physically or sexually abused, God forbid, but instead that a child has not received adequate clothing, food, things like that. Maybe their housing is inappropriate. Or if we think about other ways that neglect manifests, things like a parent's substance abuse or substance use, a parent's mental health diagnosis, a parent leaving a child home alone instead of having an adequate caretaker for them, things that I would argue are still really closely tied to poverty and to lack of access to necessary resources. And so if you look at all of that, I think what we have is a, perhaps unsurprisingly, a system that is almost entirely at 90% or above of kids in foster care are kids from families who would have received entitlements from the government. So if we're using that as kind of a proxy for poverty, we have a system that is almost entirely focused on poor children. And then we also have a system that is really disproportionately continuing to focus on Black children and on Latinx children. And so, you know, I will use my New York bias here. These are the numbers that I have on the top of my head. In New York City, 90% of kids who are involved in the child welfare system are Black or Latinx. And that, you know, in the city overall, about a third of the kids are white. There's another pretty sizable percent who are Asian. Those groups are virtually unrepresented in this system. So if we take that as the system that we have now, one that is really focusing not on the systemic causes of child maltreatment, and I think we can agree, yes, of course, we would all want for all of these children to not be suffering in any of the ways that I just described, but this isn't a system that is focused on the front end, ensuring that their families have the support and resources that they need. It's instead a system that is on the back end focused on punishing and surveilling those families once they have come to the attention of whatever authority. So then all of that then, I think, feeds into this massive foster care system, and a foster care system that is itself inflicting massive harm on families, so on children in particular, but I will say families writ large, because if a child is placed in foster care and their parents' rights are terminated to them at some point, then not only is the parent's name literally erased from the birth certificate, but that child loses not just the connections with their parents, but also potentially siblings, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, a community writ large. So I think it's also important to note that we have a huge number of children who are in foster care and staying in foster care and not being adopted, that their parents' rights are terminated and they aren't being adopted out. And they are typically children who are not babies, children who are a little bit older, or children who have some kind of special need, diagnosis, physical disability, something like that. And so we have, I think at the last I checked, it was around 115,000 kids who are just kind of in this netherworld of foster care, neither here nor there, not with their family of origin and not being adopted out. And so I think what to me kind of troubles me deeply about, there are many things that trouble me deeply about Dobbs, but a thing that troubles me deeply about Dobbs, I will say, is the fact that we are going to not create a population of these kind of highly marketable, highly adoptable infants, but instead we are going to feed into a larger body of children who are needlessly in foster care and who are not getting adopted out of foster care. And why I think that is because if we take as a starting point that there are going to be women who are denied abortions they would have otherwise gotten, then we might think, okay, what are they going to get? What are they going to do instead? And I think Amy Coney Barrett would say, oh, of course, they'll put their child up for adoption. Easy choice. Domestic market grows. Everything is great. I think the reality, though, and I say this, you know, if based on empirical studies, but also just based on kind of my relationships with people who have had to make these really kind of difficult decisions, is that even if someone is in a kind of subpar situation, if they don't have the money that they would want to have to raise their child the way that they would want to, they still want to raise their child. It is easier to have your child as an emotional matter, to love your child and to think that you are going to keep your child and raise that child, than to say, I'm going to put this child up for adoption. And so then you have people who are keeping their children and not receiving the support that they should be receiving from the government, from everyone else, and then are getting funneled into this massive system of surveillance, of family regulation, and having their children taken from them. And those children, when they are taken, will very likely, if they are older, not be adopted. And even if they are adopted, we are then going to run into all of the complications that we see with very often transracial adoptions and the loss of any kind of connection from either community of origin, their family of origin. And so I think I don't want kind of the takeaway to be, oh, we just need to adopt more kids out of foster care. That's the way to do it, recruit more people for that, because I think that creates all of those problems, right? It's not a magic solution to say, oh, we will just swoop in and rescue the foster children, because you need to grapple with the damage that is done to those children at times by the adoption itself, but also by that initial separation from their families and from their families of origin. And so I think, to me, like, to kind of hopefully bring it kind of back to the beginning when I'm talking about reproductive justice, the thing that feels really salient to me about reproductive justice is this idea that it's not just about the freedom to have children or the freedom to not have children, but the freedom to raise your children as you want to raise them. And the vast number of people who we are not providing any kind of resources, support to, so that they are able to make the kind of autonomous choices and provide for their children, raise their children in the way that even in their ideal vision, they would be wanting to.
Thank you. I have a question. I have a new friend. I keep meeting so many friends who are engaged in adoption and foster care. A new friend named Tamar Fox, who is a Jewish writer who has written very sensitively about her own experiences as a foster mom, and with the idea of sort of foster to adopt, and then coming to a place uniquely, I think it's wonderful that she had this experience and that she wrote about it, of meeting the first family, birth mother or whatever, and beginning to have a different level of empathy for their experiences than she had either had walked into the enterprise wanting to have, being encouraged to have, and began to think more about what is supposed to be the purpose of fostering, which is fostering to reunification with first family, and became very devoted to that. And it's very unusual, right? Because could you speak a little bit to the sort of catch-22 of, or not catch-22, but sort of the issues within foster care, the issues around whether to shorten the time, that one's in foster care and then is available for adoption versus et cetera, et cetera. It all seems very complicated, but if you can kind of
I think it is complicated both as kind of a legal matter, but also perhaps more importantly as an emotional matter. Because I think you have, on one hand, I think this understandable desire that really pushed through a law in the late 90s. It's called AFFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. I think I got that acronym right. That set really strict timelines for when the state must move to terminate a parent's rights once their child is in foster care. And it's a little bit convoluted, but it's 15 of the most recent 22 months. So if a child is in foster care for 15 straight months, then the state is supposed to move to terminate the parent's rights. And that's in theory in the interest of some idea of permanency, of that freeing that child for adoption would be the kind of nomenclature used in family court often. I think the problem with that is, one, that what that has done is create a massive number of children who just stay in foster care, right? That their parents' rights are terminated because that timeline is hit, but there wasn't anyone lined up to adopt them. They weren't in a pre-adoptive home. And so they are ending up in this situation where they are just bouncing from home to home. And as they get older, potentially being placed in what are, I think, politely called residential treatment centers, but I think have around the country, these RTCs are plagued with just constant lawsuits, complaints, deaths of children, sexual assaults of children, really horrific events that are taking place in those RTCs. So you have, first, that kind of large body of children who just end up in this kind of permanent state of foster care. I think you also have just the reality that 15 months is a long time for a child, right? But it's not that long for a parent who is, for example, trying to overcome a drug addiction and is being held to a standard that they need to be completely abstinent from all substances in order to regain custody of their child, or is trying to get a mental health treatment sorted out and worked out whatever medications they need to get, or something like the parent needs housing and the state isn't helping them get the housing thing, right? So 15 months, I think, is a period of time that feels really differently depending on what direction you are looking at it from. I think the other kind of flip side of that, the foster parent experience of it, I think this is in part maybe an understandable and often really good-hearted reaction to the fact that there are all these children we are hearing about who are in foster care, that people decide, oh, I'm going to foster a child with hopes of adopting them. But then that creates this kind of inherent conflict of interest where a child is placed with a foster parent who has in theory, legal obligation to do what they can to move toward reunification of that child with their parents. So that means, for example, transporting the child to visits with their parent, or allowing them to talk on the phone, or facilitating sibling visits, things like that, which I think is, for many foster parents, really contrary to their interests, right? If they are hoping and loving this child as if it is their own, then bringing the child to do all of those things and allowing for that relationship to be, continued, rebuilt, whatever, is cutting against their own ability to adopt that child. And I think there's also this dynamic that I was not really attuned to until I was a lawyer in family court. But there is this fact that foster parents and what they say are taken extremely seriously in family court proceedings. And so if a foster parent comes to court and says, Joseph had a visit with his mom last week, and when he came home, he was really upset, then the judge is going to hear that and think the mom did something upsetting at that visit. I think there's another read of that, right? What my client and the mom would say, of course, my child was upset after he saw me. He had been taken away from me. We only get 2 hours a week together. And we had to do it in this really institutional setting. And he's 4 years old, right? So I think, but the valence that is cast upon that, and especially when we are also considering that in many places, foster parents tend to be whiter and tend to be higher income than the parents who the children are removed from, their word has a lot of power. And so I think, I say this recognizing that what I am asking of foster parents is perhaps impossible, but I think that the ideal is a foster parent, right? Like your friend who says, I will love this child as if it is my own, but I will recognize that it is not my own. I will recognize that it has this other family, it has this other community that it is part of. And if there is a way for that child to return home, then that is the thing that I am moving toward. If that's not possible, if the parent is not able to take the steps they need to regain custody, or whatever else happens, then it is wonderful that the child has already formed this relationship. But I think we talk so much in family court. Judges seem to care so much about, oh, this child has been in a foster placement with this family for 2 years, and it would be so upsetting to disrupt that now. And yet so little attention is paid on the front end of that to how upsetting it was for that child to be removed from their parent, from their community of origin that they had been in for however long before that. So I think, when I say it's complicated emotionally, right, it's with this recognition of what we don't want is a return to kind of an institutional setting where we say, okay, no one should love these children because they're going to go back to their parents. But there needs to be some attention paid to the purpose of the foster system and the purpose of the foster caregiver as someone who is kind of the next best alternative and putting their heart into supporting this child while they can, and then moving forward from that.
Right, while also being open to the possibility that if there is no other, that they would be available for permanency if it after a longer term than 15 months. I mean, so that it's an emotionally incredibly complex thing to walk into. And yet the foster system, as I understand it, really needs, but there are some terrible foster parents out there. So
I think not to interrupt, but I think just very quickly, I think there's also a role of money to be or not to be paid is not what I meant, to pay attention to. But foster parents are getting money to care for children. And I think that obviously is helpful support for foster parents who are really, in this for the right reasons, but I think is also sometimes a nefarious reason that people are fostering children because it is a way that they are getting more money. And there's a whole other diatribe I could go on about why don't we give that money to their families of origin instead.
So Anna, I have a question. I just finished reading Roxana Asgharian's book, We Were Once a Family. And in Texas, and that's where the kids were put into foster care and then later adopted, but they didn't give kinship care like an aunt, the same amount of money that foster parents would receive for caring for the child. Is that true in New York as well? Or has that been, or across the country?
So I think that has now been rectified in New York, but not in other parts of the country. That definitely used to be the case in New York. It used to be the case in Texas. I think I don't want to say every jurisdiction, in many jurisdictions in the last 15 or 20 years, there has been an effort being made to give more support to kinship caregivers. And there's federal regulations that are also in place within the last couple of years that are encouraging that. But I think there's the other piece of that is the difficulty of getting kids placed with their kinship caregivers if those kinship caregivers themselves have any past contact with the child welfare system or the criminal legal system, which then creates, particularly in poor communities and in Black and Latinx communities, there's such disproportionate involvement with those systems that it can be difficult to even get the placement approved.
Right. Or even in the case of the aunt in the book, she had to somehow come up with money to buy 4 beds, which she didn't have. Yeah. And then that looks like a bad placement because they don't have beds for all the kids. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's also this other complication that goes back to that timeline issue I was talking about, where this is true in New York. In New York, if the kinship caregivers say, we don't want funds, we'll just care for this child out of, our, own pocket, then that clock doesn't start. And so it's only if the relatives say, I need money, that 15-month clock starts toward termination of parental rights, which then creates these situations where I think it can be really, really damaging to just overall dynamics in a family, because there might be a kinship caregiver who's like, I don't want this, I don't want your rights terminated, but I don't know how to care for this child if I'm not getting more money from the state. And
interesting. I did not know that. Yeah.
I was reading questions in the chat and I'm seeking clarification on questions from the chat so I can make sure to ask the questions in a way that can be answered. So but in the meantime, I don't know if you mentioned while I was doing that, that book, We Were Once a Family, is about the Hart case. Did you specify?
No, yeah, that was the Hart case. That was about the Hart case. Sarah and Jennifer Hart, a white couple that originally adopted the kids in Minnesota, up and left and moved to Washington, ended up in Oregon, and then drove the entire family over a cliff in California. It's a fascinating book for a number of reasons. Yeah, I'd highly recommend it. After I read that, I in the middle, almost done with Dorothy Roberts' Torn Apart, and highly recommend that book as well. That talks about all these issues in family policing or family regulation. I mean, I have trouble calling it child welfare as well. Yeah. Right.
For those who were in the first session, we talked about Dorothy Roberts briefly as one of the founders of the reproductive justice movement. And in more recent decades, she's been writing a great deal, focusing a great deal about the same issues that Anna is running with.
Right. What I found so interesting is that there's a secrecy in this baby scoop era adoptions, but there's invisibility of the child welfare system to much of the Americans. They have no idea what's happening in these systems. Yeah, that's just a comment.
I mean, I think there's across everything that any of us have been saying, right? The role of stigma is huge. And I think there's, the stigma of giving up a child, the stigma of being adopted, but also I think the stigma of being accused of being a bad parent. And I think, I've been involved in kind of organizing work in the family regulation space. And one of the difficulties we face is finding parents who are willing to go in public and say, this was my experience with this system, because it is, one of the worst things that we can say in our society, to say you're a bad mother and you can't care for your children. And
Right.
so it is, I think, especially, in communities that are not directly impacted, really easy for it to just go unnoticed.
Are you seeing former foster youth speaking out and organizing based on their experiences?
I think increasingly we are, and that I think has been really exciting, both in a sense of like strategy and movement, but also just in the sense of giving them voice, right? Because I think so much of what is lost in all of this is the child's experience. And so much of, I think one of the things about We Were Once a Family which I think is a truly phenomenal book, but that was hardest for me to read, that like stuck with me the most, was the experience of the three of the siblings who were killed by their adoptive parents had a brother who was also in foster care, and who was just kind of shuttled around and too old to be adopted with them and had too much problematic behavior and whatever else. And I think it is my sense from reading everything, all, her painstaking attempt to build a relationship with him and getting some insight into him, is that it never was an experience that he had that anyone was listening to him and listening to what he wanted and listening to what the experiences were that he was going through.
Yeah, Dante's story is a haunting story as well. Yeah, that's the
So
that's the name of the older brother. Yeah.
I realize that there's an interesting connection between reproductive choice access issues and foster care, and that Heather Booth, who was sort of the woman behind Jane in Chicago. I don't know if you all know the story. There was an informal network of college students and others and doctors in Chicago. And Heather Booth, who became like an amazing organizer and creator of the Midwest Organizing Institute, I think it's called, and just sort of now left-wing operative, Democratic operative, was instrumental in that. Her brother, David Tobis, I don't know if you know the name, was pretty active in New York for a very long time, organizing families impacted by the foster system, not the children of the foster system, but the parents who were losing their children, to organize amongst themselves. I have some questions. I'm not sure that anyone is going to have expertise that applies, but I'm going to ask the questions out of due diligence. One is around adoption. Are there I understand that one of the greatest, this is not me, this is the questioner, greatest variations around adoption patterns is religious belief practices. What are some of the are there generalizations around Mormons, Catholics, Jews, and other faith-based communities around their perspectives towards adoption, etc.? That's one. So if anyone feels able to field that, I'm going to see if there's a clarification.
I thought immediately of Gabrielle for that one.
Great.
Is that a question about modern practices, current practices?
I think any answer would be interesting.
Okay, so I'll speak about the current landscape, which is, there is an organization called Brave Love, which casts birth mothers as courageous women who have made a brave choice, and it sort of puts them on a pedestal of, look, you were not able for whatever reason to raise a child in this, at this particular time. You're making this incredibly brave choice, which is reversing the narrative from the baby scoop era. Women were stigmatized for having, God forbid, gotten pregnant out of wedlock. And now there's a recasting of that. and it is particularly popular is the wrong word. It is particularly embraced in evangelical America and in Mormon America. Evangelical America is really, there's a phrase about, Jesus adopting his flock, and we should be like Jesus and adopt children so we can raise them in Christianity. So that is really predominant in evangelical America. I see it when I go to red states, which I'm doing for a current project. And in the Mormon church, there's nothing more powerful than having a child and sealing that child in eternity, in the book of, not the Book of Mormon, but in the book of life, does anybody know what it's called? I should know what it's called, but anyone know?
The Book of Mormon.
The Book of
No, it's not
Mormon.
the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the doctrine. But the doctrine, so you get sealed. You go to the temple and you seal a family, and it's how, the Mormon people in the Mormon church were baptizing even my Polish grandfather, who was born in a shtetl. He wasn't born in a shtetl, but his entire family was. And the whole point is you want to be reunited with these people in heaven. So the greater the chance of reuniting in heaven, in this paradise, the better off you're going to be. And the more people you can do that for, the better off it is. And the better off it is for the entire Mormon faith. And birth mothers are really kind of cherished prior to adoptions. And I've spent a lot of time in this community as of late. And the reality of it is it reverts to the same baby scoop era narrative once the adoption has taken place. So what's shifted is, I would say, in evangelical communities and in the Mormon community, those are the only two I can speak to at the moment, is the repackaging of what it means to be a birth mother prior to the adoption, at least, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered the question. Did that?
You answered somebody's a good question. I don't know if it was the one that was asked, but you did sort of explain a little bit about the evangelical and the Mormon. I will say that there's statistics that show that Jews adopt disproportionate to their representation in the population. I mean, so the Jews are adopting more than the general population for all sorts of reasons, I think, including postponing, childbearing. And also, and Gabrielle, you and I talked about this earlier this week, Jews also have adopted, at least historically, transracially, disproportionate to the population. And I think that, and even in the 50s, when transracial adoption was first being sort of put out there, teased out there as sort of a way to get placements for kids, the leads of Louise Weiss services, for all the nefarious things that happened there in terms of research, from what we would now see as sort of narrow colorblind perspective, but then saw as a racial justice effort, were reaching to the Jewish population, who were probably more sympathetic to civil rights. And so that began a wave of more Jews probably getting into the transracial adoption, which was also not the question asked, but
no, but it's a salient point, and it's quite interesting because as outsiders, we looked at the possibility of transracial adoptions and said, oh, well, we can do this. We're already outsiders.
right.
We have part of this down. It didn't turn out to be quite so seamless, but for anybody.
Yeah.
But
I have a friend, Marla Brettschneider, who's written on being queer and Jewish, and adopting transracially is sort of like exactly like that double. We're I'm spacing on the word that we use all the time for like being a very visibly different family. But yeah. So someone wrote, interesting, I just heard a presentation today by a woman who had been adopted internationally by an American family who physically and emotionally abused her and threw her out of the house at age 18. Can one of you speak to the prevalence of and the implications of this? Okay, I'm going to turn this into a question about all sorts of things. I'm going to turn this into a question about rehoming. I'm going to turn, if anyone feels, I'm looking at Greg, actually. I don't know if this is of the danger of adopting and then changing one's mind, and what that does to children, and if it happens more at the level, if that would happen more where there's not a lot of thought either put into the relinquishment or the placement, or there's less sort of oversight generally, which it sounds like is happening increasingly, and maybe post-Dobbs even more so.
I will say that
Stab at that.
rehoming, or it's the technical term is called unregulated custody transfer, disproportionately impacts within adoption, disproportionately impacts intercountry adoptees. That's the real concern. Is I think I don't know a whole lot about the issue. I follow it because most of my work relates to adoptees who are already adults, but it is something that Congress is trying to address. What happens is that there's actually a uniform law that just now came out to control or regulate unregulated custody transfers or rehoming, but it got so watered down in that process that it doesn't really do a whole lot, and they tried to apply it to things beyond adoption as well, which really didn't make sense. So yes, it happens. In that case of intercountry adoption, it may impact obtaining citizenship for that person if they didn't already have citizenship. And of course, it's devastating to not only lose your parents, but your culture and your country, and then be rehomed in the U.S. by U.S. parents. So it is a problem. Yeah.
And in terms of an 18-year-old being estranged, being cast out by their family, just to turn the tables, you had described to me earlier some adoptees who didn't have access to their records or are very angry with their parents for mistreatment, et cetera, actually having the opportunity to kind of annul that legal transaction as adults, or
Right. Well, so there are many years adoptive parents could annul or vacate an adoption for various reasons. Much of it was eugenics based. If they were considered feeble-minded, was the term that was used, or had epilepsy was another one that was specifically included. Then you kiss the child. Kentucky just had a law that was just repealed last year that if their child that you adopted, and I'm using their terms, is ethnically different from what you expected, you could annul the adoption as well. And so those have existed for many, many decades, less so today, but there is a movement, a small movement of adult adopted people who want to vacate or annul their adoption. Typically they are abused by their parents, or sometimes it's a step parent adoption where they're estranged from that step parent because they're later divorced and sort of weren't really part of their lives anyways. And it is something that I think we should pursue, both as a point of autonomy, because to annul your adoption if you believe it's in your best interest. Not many will do it, but I think it is something that would shift that power imbalance in those abusive relationships.
it's interesting. I made when I heard that, I was like, oh, let's not talk about that. That's
no, I remember that. I was in a symposium not too long ago.
Yeah.
Well, no, I was in a symposium not too long ago with an adoptee who's also an adoptive mother, and I brought that up, Gabrielle was in that symposium too, and her reaction was like, whoa, I can't talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. And we each pushed each other on those issues. And I think she came to an understanding of it, but it was very hard for her to understand. Yeah, I talked to my wife about that today, and just, the guttural reaction is, oh my God, I'm losing my kid.
Right.
But I
Yeah, you
think
lost
that,
your kid. I mean, the reality is that a biological child can
mhm,
walk away, and that's pretty much all they can do, to say,
right.
you didn't do this right, please leave me alone. And the adopted child has other ammunition that thankfully is rarely used. But I did make the comparison when I was talking to you earlier, and I think it's worth noting that in halakha, for everybody out there, kids who are adopted are converted because as children, it's in their best interest. In many ways, it is absolutely in their best interest, and we're doing it on their behalf. Like, it's better to be raised, embraced by the community as one. And it gets very complicated, I think, when folks are fostering. It's a whole session on how we step up and as foster carers, and not be complicit in a complicated system, and do it in a way that doesn't further screw up children. I mean, that's for another time, but I don't even know if I was clear on all of the complications there. But there's a halakhic idea that a child at coming of age at bar mitzvah, what we're calling bar mitzvah, bar bat mitzvah, or anything non-gendered mitzvah, is able to reject that effort on their behalf, or embrace their Judaism at that time. And as Reconstructionists, as post-halakhic Jews, we can either just ignore that, or we can take it seriously and talk with our kids about what this moment means. And yeah, it's complicated, but not unrelated to this idea of, like, you did this for me, but now I'm saying no. And it doesn't happen very often that they say no.
It's extremely rare. Yeah.
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 We're at time. So generally, the last two sessions, we've given people the permission to say goodnight. We've let people come off. And I'm sorry if I missed any questions. There is a social worker online who can speak for herself, because she's had a lot of great experiences, and points out that a disproportionate number of child welfare social workers are Jewish. And I don't know exactly how that affects all of this conversation, but give permission to people to come off mute and say hello. Give permission to people to say goodnight because it's 9 o'clock. And, if people want to hang for a little bit and raise other questions, use the sort of hand raising function. Gabrielle, Anna, and Gregory, can you stay for a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay. We'll continue recording, and as long as things go smoothly, we'll keep it in the session. So everybody come off mute. Can everyone come off mute now, Carol?
Yes,
And at least say, good evening.
Joe has her hand up.
And Joe has a question.
Do most states still age out foster kids, like throw them out of the system and leave them on their own?
The short answer is yes. There's some flexibility. Some states allow for children to voluntarily remain in foster care until they're 21 instead of 18. And there is some effort in most places to provide some kind of support to them. But I think what that support looks like is really, really limited. I think California, I want to say, recently introduced, or maybe even passed, a bill that is one of the first bills, I think maybe the first, that will give foster children who have aged out a monthly stipend for, I don't think there is a time limit to it. I think it's several $100s that they will get for the rest of their lives. But that is pretty, like I said, it's either the first or one of the first laws like that. But yeah, for the most part, I think it's this very strange thing where the legal fiction that we are operating under is that the state is operating as the parent, that like they have stepped into the role of the parent. And yet once the child turns 18, 21, whatever it is, a lot of times, given their experience in foster care, the children, now adults, don't want anything to do with the system at all anymore, given their experiences in it. But two, there is not kind of the ongoing support and efforts to make sure that they are actually prepared for adulthood that you would hope that actual parents might be imparting to their children.
Thank you. Annie.
So, this brought up so much for me. And I actually, after reading the New Yorker article that you circulated last night, I had a long talk today with my interracially, internationally social worker adopted daughter. So who insists that she has none of these feelings, that she knows that they're very common, that she's very unusual. And that, she recognizes that her brother definitely does have much more of a feeling of being different. But she gets annoyed when people assume that she has some of these abandonment feelings that adoptees are assumed to have. And I'm wondering, she says that from everything she knows, from everything she's studied, she knows that's very unusual. I am curious about how unusual it actually is. And I guess I was thinking, Greg, you said,
Well, I can't speak for all adopted people.
no, I know, but you said you felt something when you had a child. She is not yet and may never have a child biologically. So I don't know if this is something she may feel, or if this is part of her reason for not wanting to have a child biologically, which at this point she does not.
Right. It's interesting. It's actually kind of a controversial issue within the adoptee rights community. But I mean, I have a brother who's not interested. He's adopted different biological parents, not interested whatsoever in anything related to his biological family, and that's just him. And so certainly there's a wide variety of responses to adoption and how you think of your identity, and some included, and it's a very important part of the identity, which it is for me. But it's not an important part of other people's identity. It may be later, or it may not be at all. And that's just sort of like, sometimes people call adoption both and. It's a both and issue, not an either
No,
or.
and it is. And I have two children who have very different attitudes
Right.
toward it.
Yeah.
And I accept and respect that. But but I find, I don't know, I guess reading the New Yorker article in particular, which I assume all of you have read, and there was this sense that this feeling is universal, and the people who don't share it just haven't come out of the fog yet, and are
Right.
eventually have some issues. And I
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big believer in the well, I think people have their personal experiences with what they call the fog. You come out of the fog and you realize that, your adoptive identity is much more complicated than you originally thought. But that's also used against people who are perfectly fine with their adoption, and they're saying, and then adoptees say, well, you just haven't come out of the fog yet. Well, I think that's really dismissive of their own personal experience and how they view adoption. I will say that what I think I know which article you're talking about. I will say that was one of the first major mainstream media articles, it's a long article, that did a really good job of describing the complications of adoptees' feelings. And we don't often get that from mainstream media. We get the sort of rosy pictures of what adoption is uncomplicated, sometimes with a savior kind of complex with
that was totally true.
transracial adoption. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I found really great about that article, and other adoptees found with that article. Finally, someone is writing an article that is true to our stories.
Yeah. I did think that, and it did actually mention at one point that one of the adoptees, the young Korean woman, had
Mhm.
3 adopted Korean sisters, and none of them shared her concerns. And that was sort of what my daughter reacted to is, yeah, look, there are 3 other kids that are mentioned in this article who don't share the experiences of these
Not
feelings.
everybody's the same.
I think the issue too for many adoptees is that we're always adopted. and it doesn't go away. And so who knows what your daughter may think in 20 years or 10 years. I will say that reuniting with my mother and knowing my origins and who my biological parents are has actually strengthened my relationship with my adoptive parents. So lean into that if they do reach out to you to talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you both. Linda.
Yeah.
Grabowski.
Hi, I'm the social worker. I'm the one who did child welfare work, and I was the one who had to go into the homes that had no heat or lights, no food in the refrigerator, and make a decision to remove the child and what we were going to do for the family. So there was always the intent, if at all possible, as you know, to do family reunification and trying to find someone who could take the child for the period of time while the family got themselves together. In all of that time, I never saw a non-family member say no, even though there was, at the time, this is back in the early 2000s, there was no money coming from the state of Maryland to help in kinship care. There was like nothing. The families had to fight to get the kid on Medicaid if they weren't on Medicaid or CHIP. You know, it was a real struggle. There was not a lot to offer the kids. I think fast forward, we have made some improvements, but I was wondering, you know, and I'm not asking you to weigh in on child welfare per se, but what are the other policy levers? I mean, you raise some legitimate issues about, you know, pushing kids out to adoption, away from their birth families, only being in it to feed the adoption agency troughs. You know, what are the other policy levers that we could fight for as advocates?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was on a panel yesterday where I think how I summed it up was, you know, we just need a fundamental restructuring of society. So I'll give a more concrete answer than that. But I think that a lot of it involves thinking broader than just the foster system or the child welfare system itself, and thinking about things like, I think a really fascinating example is the example of what child welfare looked like in New York City during COVID and during particularly the early COVID shutdown. And in that period of time where the child welfare agency really pulled back its operations in a number of ways, and I won't get it. There's a lot of data showing children stayed as safe despite that. But a lot of what was helping families was that they were getting more money from the government. They were getting the child tax credit, they were getting the increased unemployment checks, and they were getting stimulus payments. And so there were these new forms of just cash in people's pockets with no strings attached, no requirement that you know, do your back to work program or accept it in a form that's only going to be accepted at, you know, certain grocery stores or whatever. And I think there's been other studies since then that have shown that there was a massive drop in child poverty as a result of those infusions of cash, and as a result, a massive drop in child neglect. So I think when I'm talking about like thinking broad, there's things like that. There's things like access to healthcare, you know, moving toward a more universal system of healthcare, moving toward improvements in schools that are ensuring that children are actually getting the educations they want. But I think within the system itself, I think a lot of what there are changes that have happened in the last 20 years that I think are moving in a better direction. So if we look at foster care populations around the country, they have been dropping. But I think that we continue to have, you're obviously, you know, I'm not saying there are not situations like the one you described where there are these really dire situations, and whether it's the parents' fault or not, children are suffering as a result. But I think we also more broadly have a huge number of mandated reporters who are calling in reports that are not warranted and therefore are subjecting families to surveillance that they are not should not be subject to. So the number of investigations nationally that are unsubstantiated is 83%. So 83% of calls that are made are investigated and found to not meet the legal definition of child maltreatment. And so I think that is not only subjecting all of those families to the system, but it also is meaning that the agencies cannot put their resources into investigating and supporting the much smaller percent of cases where there is actually child maltreatment. And there have been other studies that have shown that when there are fewer investigations, it is easier for caseworkers to conduct accurate investigations. So I think there's this idea that, is often called narrowing the front door, but thinking about how we can reduce the number of reports received in the first place, so that not only is there more time, more resources for each family, but also there's this huge problem, which I'm sure you are deeply familiar with, of just burnout among the workers in the field who are doing all of this. So I think part of it is just thinking about how do we reduce the number of needless cases that are entering into the system, and then, winnowing away from there.
If there aren't any more questions, maybe we can just take ourselves off mute and say thank you, which I'd like to say thank you to all of our speakers. It's been wonderful to have you and a really rich discussion. Thank you all for coming, and the
Thank
people
you
who
all.
are
Thank
left,
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, well,
Great
thanks for
discussion.
so
doing
much.
this, Minna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.